Well, as talks about making COVID-19 vaccine not compulsory, but the word is mandatory, is the word that we're looking for. As that talk continues, some businesses are already in tune. Discovery is reportedly taking steps to make all its buildings vaccinated-only zones. The company is also set to introduce a mandatory vaccination policy for the group's South African-based employees from the 1st of January 2022. For more on this, let's speak now to the head of COVID-19 task team at Discovery, Dr. Ron Whelan. Doctor, thank you so much for joining me. So I suppose let's start with this, Doc. The difference between compulsory vaccination and mandatory vaccination, it seems to trip people up. But those two are not the same thing, are they?
Well, firstly, thank you for hosting us. Great to be with you this afternoon, and good afternoon to your viewers. Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think there's subtle differences. So Discovery's intention is to implement a mandatory vaccination policy from the 1st of January onwards. And I think within the confines of that policy, there are processes that we provide for the acknowledgement of your certain medical rights, as well as religious rights, as well as constitutional rights. And then there's a reasonable accommodation process that goes with that. So it really sets out a framework for implementing some level of mandatory vaccination, recognizing there are a number of factors at play. So it's a process that will engage with our employees on a mutual respect basis. And at the same time, I think we're confident that by the time 1st of January rolls around, most Discovery staff and employees would have been vaccinated in any event. We're seeing very good uptake on vaccinations, and many Discovery employees are seen as leaders in their communities. And the vaccination, I'm confident that most people would have been vaccinated by the end of the year in any event.
So it seems to me then, Doctor, unless I've missed it, that your policy on mandatory vaccination goes a bit further than other policies that I've heard of, in that you intend to have all your buildings designated as vaccinated-only zones. What does that mean? It seems to me that it goes beyond talking about your employees, but anyone seeking to enter a building that belongs or where Discovery operates.
Well, exactly. I think the first thing is we feel a strong social and moral obligation to do everything we can to protect all South Africans, and certainly all people that come into our buildings. And I think we've seen the effect of COVID on the landscape. We've lost over 14,000 clients. We've lost over 20 employees two weeks ago. So it's been devastating for us. So there's a strong moral and social obligation for us. It's also important to point out that we have a legal obligation to keep our workplaces entirely safe. So the Occupational Health and Safety Act explicitly states that employers have an obligation to make sure that their workplaces are safe for all of their employees. And we're working within the confines of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, as well as all of the Labour Relations Acts, to implement these policies and to make sure that our officers and indeed our Discovery stores are safe for everyone who comes into those stores. As per our mandatory vaccination policy for employees, there will be an appeals and exception process. There will be grounds for reasonable accommodation for those individuals who, for a variety of reasons, cannot be vaccinated, whether those are religious or medical reasons. So there is an exception process to that. But for all intents and purposes, you're correct in saying that all Discovery offices and buildings will become vaccinated-only zones. I think it's also important to point out this is not unusual. Many countries and companies globally have adopted similar policies. Most of the big tech firms and banks in the US have made their offices vaccination-only zones. We're seeing similar trends across Europe. And then, of course, countries adopting similar policies. So France, for example, requires vaccination to enter into restaurants and flights and trains and various other public facilities.
So in terms of those employees that will be accommodated within this reasonable accommodation policy that you will put in place, what will be the trade-off there? Will you be doing what I'm hearing more and more companies introducing to say, well, you know, if you don't want to be vaccinated, you will have to provide us with a COVID-19 test, a negative test every week that you pay for, or are you taking a slightly different approach to that?
Well, it certainly could come to that. I think that's one of the options around reasonable accommodation. Permanent work from home is another option around reasonable accommodation. N95 masks are another option around reasonable accommodation. What we intend to do is to evaluate every case on a case-by-case basis, balancing the rights of the employee who chooses not to be vaccinated for a variety of reasons with the health and safety of our officers. So we'll navigate this as a process, and where there are reasonable accommodations required on the basis of various grounds, we'll certainly look to implement those reasonable accommodations. If, of course, it's impossible to deliver on those reasonable accommodations given our operational and business requirements for everyone to spend at least some time in the office, then we'll obviously have to look at your other mechanisms. And I think in the very unlikely cases, there's some level of parting of ways, but we think that's a very unlikely outcome.
Lastly, Doc, I'm almost completely out of time. Just your thinking around the supply chain, the value chain, and businesses that you collaborate with outside of Discovery. When you talk about a vaccinated-only zone, in as far as a building is concerned, I think it has implications for, such ordinary people as a courier service employee coming to deliver mail to you guys at Discovery, a journalist coming to interview you at Discovery. This will apply to all of us. Have you thought about the implications and the efficiencies or otherwise that will be introduced in your workflow?
Yeah, absolutely. It will impact anyone who comes into our buildings, whether those are suppliers or customers or visitors. So that policy is equally applicable to them. We, of course, can't extend that policy beyond our buildings, so can't impact the way suppliers behave, and we certainly have no intention of impacting that. But for anyone who comes into our buildings would be under the auspices of the same policy. It's a difficult decision. At the same time, as I mentioned before, we feel a very strong moral obligation here to do everything we can to protect people from SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. We know that these vaccines are effective at reducing infection risk, and we need to put this as a tool in our armor to protecting everyone across our business and indeed South Africa more broadly.
All right, thank you for that. That's Dr. Ron Whelan from Discovery. He is the head of the company's COVID-19 task team, talking to us there about their mandatory vaccination policy as well as vaccinated-only designation of the buildings that belong to that company.